Hello, and welcome to another week of Central Reads, our 2024 Bible reading plan. This is a great week of reading. We're reading a bunch of chapters from 1 Kings, and then a few Psalms at the end. But these chapters from 1 Kings are filled with stories that are just so important. The first few have to do with Solomon and the temple and his dedication of the temple, and then kind of what happens and kind of the downfall of Solomon. It's so important because this is really the moment in the history of Israel where things start to fall apart. When he dedicates the temple, this is in chapter 8, Solomon gives this beautiful, beautiful prayer to God about God's faithfulness, his covenant with his father David, and his covenant with him. And he says in verse 27 in chapter 8, "But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Even heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you, much less this house that I built." Right? And this is a theme that is just woven throughout the Old Testament, throughout the prophets, throughout the rest of the history of Israel, but it comes back in a big way in the New Testament because so much of Jesus's kind of confrontation with Israel was about the temple and about where God was and who had access to God and about the presence of God. And the big assumption at the time of Jesus was that God was in the temple and therefore we kind of own God. We kind of control God's presence. And Jesus is not on board with that idea, to say the least. In the very next chapter of 1 Kings, in chapter 9, after Solomon had built the temple and dedicated the temple, God appeared to Solomon and said, "Hey, good news. I heard your prayer, and I have consecrated this house, and I'll put my name there forever. I'll be with you forever. You'll be on the throne forever. Your successors will be forever. But if you turn aside from following me, you or your children, don't keep my commandments and statutes, and if you worship other gods," that's really the big one, "then I'm gonna cut off Israel from the land that I gave them. And this house that I have consecrated for my name, I will cast out of my sight, and Israel will become a proverb and a taunt among all the peoples." And he says in verse 8, it's devastating, "This house will become a heap of ruins. Everyone passing by it will be astonished and will hiss. They will say, 'Why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this house?' And then they will say, 'Because they abandoned the Lord their God, who brought their ancestors out of the land of Egypt and embraced other gods, worshiping them and served them, and the Lord brought this disaster upon them.'" I mean, it's devastating because that's the story of the people of Israel. And that's the situation that Jesus is confronting. This is the core of the false religion that Jesus was confronting. They thought that God was there. They thought that they owned God. They thought because they had the temple, they had God's presence. And Jesus says, "Look, this temple, I'll destroy it. It will become a heap of ruins, basically. And I will rebuild it," Jesus says. Not talking about the temple, but talking about his body. So, I mean, this is so important to understanding God's presence and how Jesus encountered the temple and the religion of his day. And then later in 1 Kings, we'll read, in 1 Kings 17, 18, and 19. These are the stories of Elijah and Elisha. And these stories are famous and they're important and they're foundational, but they're also just intriguing and fascinating. And so read this week with all kinds of wonder in your eyes, because these are great stories. Again, please feel free to follow up with me, ask me questions. I'd love to be able to sit down and talk and answer questions and have a discussion. And I don't have all the answers, but we can find them together. All right, have a great week of reading.